Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History 5 podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Warren Carter. Warren Carter is the LaDonna Kramer Meinders Professor of New Testament at Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. From 2007 to 2019, he was Professor of New Testament at Bright Divinity School, TCU, Fort Worth, Texas. 4 times he has been voted the Clark Faculty Excellence Award by Bright students. In 2014, he was awarded the John Gammey Distinguished Scholar Award by the Southwest Commission on Religious Studies. Before going to Bright, he was Thurgood Professor of New Testament at St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City, Missouri. A native of New Zealand, he is a graduate of Victoria University of Wellington with a bachelor's and bachelor's honors, first class, the Melbourne College of Divinity, Bachelor of Divinity, Master's of Theology in Princeton Theological Seminary, New Jersey, PhD in New Testament Studies. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Warren Carter.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And before we get started, I want to let the audience know that this discussion today is based on 2 of Warren Carter's books. The first one I'll mention is 1, 2, and 3 John, Multiple Readings, Deconstructing Constructions. And lastly, John and Empire, Initial Explorations. The links to purchase both these books will be in the affiliate links in the description below and also the pinned comment as well. So I'll get started with the first question. When was John's Gospel written, and which emperor ruled the Roman Empire when John was written?
Yeah, we don't know exactly when the Gospel was written because we don't have a dated manuscript, but commonly scholars have located it in the last decades of the 1st century, the 80s or the 90s. So we're some 60 or so years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Scholars have seen in the Gospel sort of a development process which has taken place over a number of decades. So the 80s or the 90s is where sort of the consensus has landed. The emperor at the time was the Emperor Domitian, who became emperor in the year 81 and was emperor until he was murdered in the year 96. He was the 3rd of the Flavian emperors. His father Vespasian had ruled for 10 years, and then his older brother Titus had ruled from 79 to 81 when he died. There were rumors that Domitian had helped end Titus's existence on planet Earth, but they're rumors and nobody knows for sure whether it actually happened. So Domitian came to power in 81 and had a fairly stormy rule in relation to a number of leading senators in Rome and some consuls. He managed to kill a number of them. So he was hardly deeply loved as an emperor and leader, and he came to a grisly end himself when he was murdered in 96. So he'd ruled for 15 years or so. It seems that his wife might well have been involved in the plot to actually murder him in the end. So not a highly loved figure, but I think one that probably has had little to do with what was happening around the community of John's Gospel in Ephesus.
So was Emperor Domitian more toward the end of his reign widely hated in the empire?
He was widely hated, especially in Rome. How extensive that was through the empire, I'm not at all sure, but certainly in Rome, he managed to create enemies and tried to eliminate enemies, and of course that just added more and more. So I don't think the Gospel is particularly exclusively or particularly anti-Domitian. I don't think he's a target in the Gospel in that direct sense. But of course, he's the head of a massive imperial structure. He's the head of a very powerful empire. And I think the Gospel is very concerned with those imperial structures and practices, personnel over which he presided, even at some distance.
What is the plot of John's Gospel?
Plot centers on Jesus, not surprisingly. who's introduced right at the beginning in the opening prologue, the opening 18 verses, as God's representative, as God's agent, as God's revealer. And he's given the prime credentials as a revealer in that he was in the beginning with God. So as an authoritative revealer, you can't really outdo that. You can't go earlier than in the beginning. And of course, in antiquity, ancientness or antiquity was a guarantee of authority, just as origin with God was a guarantee of authority in terms of the Gospel's framework. So that's where Jesus is introduced in this opening prologue, and then carries out his activity, particularly with his words, with teaching, and with his actions, such as healings and feedings. But enters into, from especially about chapters 5 through 12, enters into conflict with the power group in Judea, the Jerusalem-based Rome-allied elite forces in Judea, Jerusalem, who resent his challenge of the status quo and his questioning of their credentials, their leadership. And so from chapter 5 on through chapter 12, there are increasing references to their resentment and hostility towards Jesus and his hostility toward them. That's not one-sided. And increasingly references to their willingness to kill him and to remove him. So that's all set in place by the end of chapter 12. And then the gospel sort of takes an interlude from 13 through 17, where Jesus meets with his followers, with his disciples, kind of in a retreat situation. These chapters are often called the farewell discourse, where he sort of gives them a pep talk about how they should go on living and being faithful to his teaching once he has gone. And then immediately from that, from 13 through 17, immediately into 18 and 19, we have the so-called passion narrative, the final working out of Jesus' execution, his rejection through crucifixion, which, of course, holds out, displays the extent to which Roman power will go to remove a critic of its status quo. But that's not the end of the story. And in chapters 20 and 21, we have the resurrection stories that Rome, despite its incredible power and reach, can't keep Jesus dead. And so the story ends with this sort of triumph of God's life-giving power that is greater than the worst that Rome can do to God's agent. And so we have this sort of vindication scene in the last couple of chapters. So that's the plot. Centers on Jesus, doing what he's commissioned to do in the context of opposition and hostility, gathering an alternative community of followers, paying for his critique, but vindicated by God.
What kind of genre is the Gospel of John a part of? Can we tell at all?
Yeah, this has been a question that's been debated. I think it belongs to the genre of ancient biography. Now, ancient biographies were not like contemporary kiss and tell biographies, where the more salacious or the more sensational one can be, the better. Ancient biographies very much focused on a leading character, an esteemed character, whether a successful military figure, a philosopher, a ruler of some sort, and told the story of that person's life, starting with their distinguished ancestors, their birth, their public service, through to their death. And what was held up in an ancient biography was sort of the virtues, the good things, the accomplishments of this particular figure, and held up so others could emulate their way of life and their commitments, their virtues, their actions, etc. And I think that's what we have fundamentally in the gospel, with a bit of a riff on that ancient biography, because the subject is not one who is an elite, distinguished, powerful figure. The subject, Jesus, is one from Nowheresville in Galilee, who trots around Galilee and Judea, hardly the center of the empire, who doesn't have a distinguished military or political career, but is a social prophet. And so we've got a bit of a riff on this genre. But likewise, the things that Jesus does and the things that Jesus says are held up for his followers to emulate. So, you know, he heals folks, he provides food for folks, and he tells his followers before he is crucified that these and greater works they should be doing in his absence. So, you know, he's setting up a pattern of imitation, and just as in an ancient biography one is to imitate what the famous person did or said, so likewise in the gospel one is to imitate what Jesus has taught and what Jesus has done. So I think we have an ancient biography that sets out this character to be imitated, to learn from his teaching, to follow his deeds, to be the center of a community who continues his activity.
What is the genre of imperial negotiation, and does it apply at all to John's gospel?
Yeah. I don't think I would talk about imperial negotiation as a genre, not in a literary sense anyway, but certainly as a type of a way of being in the world, sort of a social stance in a sense, a way of being. How does one engage? How does one interact with the larger society? And of course, in the Gospels context, the larger society that is an imperial society, based in perhaps a city like Ephesus in the province of Asia. So if you're a follower of Jesus who was crucified by a Roman governor, which is hardly the strongest recruiting platform that one could imagine, but if you're a follower of such a crucified figure, then how did you make your way in this world where, and in a place like Ephesus, where Roman power was on display everywhere as part of this empire? And folks have tried to think about this in a number of ways. So when I use the term negotiation, I'm not saying that the Jesus folks sat down with the imperial governors and they had bagels and coffee and came to some agreement. I'm not talking about that. Some folks have tried to talk about the dynamic as one of persecution, and we simply don't have any evidence for that. You were kind enough to wave my John and Empire book around earlier. One of the reviewers of that book accuses me of positing persecution as the dynamic that was operative in the late first century. I actually argue explicitly against that. I don't think persecution was the name of the game. Some have tried to say that they were part of a synagogue community or related to a synagogue community, and so they were sectarian, withdrawn from society. But every evidence that we have about synagogues suggests that synagogue folks were very much engaged with and participants in their larger society, even while being faithful to their own traditions. And I think that's the more likely model for this imperial negotiation that Jesus folks are having to undertake, that it's not one thing, it's not either complete submission, nor is it violent opposition, which is often the sort of the binaries that can get set up. It's neither of those things, but I think it involves various dynamics, various strategies. Part of it is simply survival. You know, you've got to work to earn to earn enough to feed yourself and your household and do it all again tomorrow. So partly it's survival, partly it's accommodation. But also in the gospel, we have a lot of mimicry. We have a lot of imitation. It's no accident that, and we can talk about this separately, but it's no accident that the emperor, of course, is called the father of the fatherland. And father is the dominant term in the gospel for God. It's used 120 or so times. So there's a lot of mimicry, there's a lot of overlap. But at the same time, the gospel tells a different story. This isn't a story of imperial greatness. Well, not Rome's imperial greatness. It might be a story of God's greatness, but it's not a story of Rome's imperial greatness. So there's both mimicry and some dissent going on at the same time. And studies of what happens when colonized folks experience a colonizing power indicate that there can be a whole bunch of under the disguise of apparent accommodation and apparent compliance, where folks have an alternative story, where folks engage in fantasies of revenge, where folks gossip and rumor about the dominant power. We have a marvelous study by a guy called James Scott around this sort of material. And I think the gospel tells that sort of alternative story. You can imagine the Romans saying, well, we had this troublemaker in Galilee and Judea, we took care of him and killed him, which would be the official imperial story. But the gospel says, well, no, it actually wasn't like that. You didn't kill him in such a way that was the end, because God's power was greater and God raised him from the dead. So we have an alternative story that's being formulated amongst this group. So I see the imperial negotiation as being very multifaceted, a number of dynamics. It's not one thing, but it's inevitable. They live in a city where Roman power is constantly displayed. So it's not a matter of, can you avoid the empire? No, you can't. You get out of bed and stub your toe on the empire. It's everywhere. So how do you make your way as a follower of Jesus in this context? And I think the gospel helps Jesus folks to find those sorts of ways through multiple strategies to be faithful, but also to survive in the midst.
What do we know about the images and titles of Jesus in the Roman imperial context?
Well, the gospel uses a number of images for Jesus. Of course, it describes his teaching, it describes his activities, what the gospel calls his signs, his miraculous actions. But it also has a particular liking for certain images or titles that get repeated through the gospel. And I think these are really interesting in terms of ways of negotiating Roman power. A couple of them are terms that aren't used of emperors, but a number of them are used of emperors. So, for example, Jesus is called Messiah or Christ, which is not used of emperors, but it's a term that means anointed or sanctioned. So it's a reminder that Jesus is God's agent in the midst of all of this. Likewise, we have this term Son of Man that's used for Jesus, which is borrowed from the book of Daniel chapter 7, where it refers to a very powerful agent of God who sets up God's rule over the empires of the world. So calling Jesus Son of Man has some spice to it. It's not a nice, neutral, religious, confessional term, but it's got some bite. It evokes the story from Daniel of a key figure who's going to end the empires of the world, which is a fairly confrontational confession or title to be making. But we have other terms that are used for Jesus that are used for emperors. Readers of John's Gospel, of course, know that Jesus is called the Good Shepherd. Well, we have this image, of course, across the whole biblical tradition. God is the shepherd of Psalm 23. In a passage in the prophet Ezekiel 34, Israel's leaders are absolutely castigated, absolutely attacked for being bad shepherds because they don't care for the people, but they just look after their own interests. So often, people think in terms of those sorts of images across the biblical tradition. But the shepherd is also an image for emperors. We have several references, or a number of references to emperors as being shepherds. One reference talks about, the task of the emperor as the good shepherd is to shear the sheep, but not skin them. So, sort of calculated, cynical rule of exploitation, but not too far. We have other exhortations to emperors to be good shepherds who look after the sheep, who care for the sheep, but don't flay them or skin them. So here's an image that links both Jesus and the emperors. And of course, it's in the context of a critique of imperial power. So it puts the two images, the two figures together. But clearly in the gospel context, one is going to be more favored than the other. We have a bunch of these sorts of things. The same sort of thing happens with the language of savior in the gospel. It's also a term that's used for emperors. The term Son of God is an agent of God, commonly used for emperors to associate themselves with previous emperors as sons of the god, as a representative with power and deserving of honor and recognition, etc. Those are again the terms that are shared between Jesus and emperors, and so there's mimicry, there's contest, there's comparison, all these things happening at the same time. The other title that I think is particularly important and dangerous in the gospel is the reference to Jesus as King of the Jews. This is dangerous because the only way you got to be King of the Jews in the Roman world was to be appointed by the emperor to be King of the Jews. And Jesus, of course, is not appointed by the emperor to be King of the Jews. So it's actually a treasonous term. So when people refer to Jesus as King of the Jews, when Pilate says to Jesus, "Are you King of the Jews?" basically this is a charge of treason. It's a charge of sedition. And so Jesus is crucified as King of the Jews, as a illegitimate popular king, but one that is not sanctioned by Roman power. We have that little argument at when Jesus is on the cross, and Pilate's going to put a placard or a notice on the cross saying, "The King of the Jews." And some of the Jerusalem leaders want him to change it to say, "This man said, I am King of the Jews." So trying to distance themselves from him. But this is what gets Jesus put on the cross. This claim, which is understood to be seditious. So these titles are collision titles. There's contest, there's mimicry, but there's expression of competing claims being made in them.
What does the archaeological evidence indicate regarding the literary context of the Gospel of John?
Yeah, the story is set in Galilee and Jerusalem, but in terms of the approach that I'm taking with it, it's being heard in a city such as Ephesus. Whether it was written there or not, we don't know, but it was at least heard in a city like Ephesus. Ephesus was the capital of the Roman province of Asia, and it was a city that displayed Roman power in all sorts of ways. particularly with Roman buildings, stadia, baths, temples, lots of statues of significant people, inscriptions, coins displaying the headshot of emperors. There were festivals that paraded images of imperial figures and emperors through the city on a regular basis. They were all funded by a guy called Salutaris. There was a toll house that was set up, dedicated to the Emperor Nero, to collect tolls or taxes on fishing industry in the harbor of Ephesus at the time. So these sorts of things all display Roman power. But one of the really important ones, I think, is that in the year 89 or 90, a temple was dedicated to the Sebastoi, dedicated to the powerful Roman emperors. So here was a big concrete monument, if you like, a big stone monument that depicted Roman claims of sovereignty, claims of ownership, claims of power in Ephesus, all of which came with this sort of ideological sanction that Rome was chosen by the gods to rule the world and to rule its subjects and to benefit its elite, to benefit its ruling group as the favored of the gods, of course, at the expense of the rest of the population. So this is a sort of city environment, I think, that is the context for the hearing of the story of John's Gospel.
Can you tell us about the phrase in John's Gospel, pater patria, and what it refers to?
Yeah, this is a Latin phrase which literally means pater, father of the fatherland. So this is a term used for emperors. It designates their rule over a household. So the empire is kind of imaged as a household, and all its inhabitants are lucky enough to be children of the emperor. And so clearly, by using that language, pater patriae, father of the fatherland, it's a very patriarchal image. It's an image of power. It's an image of control. But it's also an image of benefaction. The emperor on his good days is supposed to look out for the subjects of the empire, supposed to care for them, all 60 or so million, however many there were. Benefactions bringing life and security, etc., to folks. As a ruler, of course, as a judge, as one who upheld the values and commitments of the empire, who shaped this community, this big household over which the emperor presided. Of course, he had agents. He couldn't do all of this by himself. So he had governors and other rulers around the empire to represent his authority. And of course, as such a powerful and benign father, he expected honor. He expected to be honored. Now, there was no mandatory worship of the emperor, but there was some encouragement to express one's gratitude and one's appreciation in honoring the emperor in this way. And I think it's a really important phrase because in the gospel, this is the dominant image for God. God is the Father. So again, we have this collision of language between the way that God is presented and the way that in the imperial world, the emperor is presented. But they're not just equals, even if they are in conflict, and even though they do similar things. God has benefactions, and God sets rules, and God has a household, and all these sorts of things. They're very similar, but in a sense, of course, when the gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word was with God. Then you've got this claim to antiquity. you've got this claim to ancientness. And so it's a claim to authority, it's a claim to be unchallenged by anything else. And so whatever claims emperors want to make, they're going to be relativized in this context of claims that are being made about God.
So now I want to return to what you were to what I was asking about earlier and what you were addressing about Domitian. Is the Gospel of John anti-Domitian? And what I mean by that question is it adopting Domitianic titles and attributing it to Jesus? Like some scholars, like Paul Anderson, look at it like "my Lord and my God" being applied to Jesus is an imitation of Domitian.
Mm-hmm. I think some of what I've mentioned in terms of shepherd and son of God, those sorts of things, I think are in imitation of not just Domitian, but emperors in general. The "my Lord and my God," which we have attested by Dio Cassius and I think Suetonius, actually uses different language than we have in the Gospel. Different terms. So in that attribution, despotes is the word in the Gospel. Of course, it's kurios. So I'm not sure that it's that precise a link because of the different language, but it does get close to imitating those same sorts of claims to rule and power and control and etc., those sorts of things. But again, how widely Domitian was addressed as "my Lord and my God" has been debated by a number of scholars, and Paul and I disagree on this. It's how much was it actually used? How much was it a post-Domitian slam on him in the subsequent histories? A dead emperor is a fair game for any sorts of accusations, right? So some scholars have sort of seen it as something that is a slam, is a post-mortem polemic against Domitian, but how widely known it was, I think, is another issue as well.
How does John's Gospel portray Jesus in relation to God the Father?
So the Gospel begins by locating Jesus in the beginning with God. So Jesus' ultimate authorization is his origin and his antiquity with God. And I think this is a really important sort of legitimation for Jesus' revelation that gets made through the Gospel, the revealer of a different sort of world than the imperial world, an agent of God's purposes, the visibility of God, the audibility of God. When you hear Jesus, you hear God. When you see Jesus, you see God. Those sorts of claims that the Gospel makes. So he enacts the divine will. His works display the divine purposes. So his power, his actions are all derivative from this divine sanctioning from God. Clearly in relationship to God, close relationship. I and the Father are one in terms of being of one will. Jesus carrying out God's mission. So all of this, all of what Jesus is doing is framed from the very beginning by this very intimate and powerful relationship with God.
Is John's Gospel turning Jesus into a rival of Roman emperors?
Yeah, I think so. A rival and a little bit more. Rival in the sense that, as I've said, with these various titles, with the things that Jesus does, with the claim to allegiance from people, this mimicry, this imitation, the gospel sets Jesus alongside these imperial claims. But in that sense, there's no call in the gospel to open rebellion. There's no call to violence. There's no call to set about overthrowing the empire. I think that's probably very, very much a reflection of just being realistic and strategic. I mean, they're not going to be able to do this, so it's silly to set up a possibility that it's going to happen. But rather the creation of a different community or a different household, to go back to that father language, is a community that has different commitments, different values, and its healings sets about repairing the damage that the empire does to folks who lack adequate resources. So, there's that sense of being a rival, of being an alternative. But in the end, I think for the gospel, this turn to the past at the very beginning, this antiquity in the beginning, sets Jesus and his mission above anything that Rome can do. And I think that's followed through in the crucifixion and in the resurrection. Crucifixion looks like Roman victory, but resurrection shows that victory is incomplete. It shows the limits of Roman power. God's life-giving power is more powerful. And of course, as Son of Man, Jesus talks about returning. And given the Daniel echoes of that, that's going to mean the end of the Roman Empire. Of course, it didn't quite happen like that, but that's the narrative that I think the gospel sets out.
What is important about Emperor Gaius Caligula?
Yeah, in the last part of the book, John and Empire, in an appendix, I talk about an episode in the life of the Emperor Gaius Caligula from around the year 40 or so. And what I'm doing, and I'll elaborate that in just a moment, but what I'm doing here is that there's been a lot of speculation for a long time amongst scholars. How did John get to be like this? How did John's gospel get to be distinctive? How did it get to not be like Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And various scholars over a long time have suggested various influences or features that have brought about this difference. So, at one stage it was fashionable to postulate sources of Gnosticism as influencing the gospel. There have been claims about Samaritans. There have been claims about wisdom traditions. There have been claims about multiple versions going through a creation process given different circumstances. Some folks have appealed to orality to explain all of this. What I do in this appendix is sort of say, well, okay, what accounts for the gospel may not just be these religious factors and religious traditions, but just as I'm claiming that in the final reading of the gospel in a place like Ephesus, there's this enormous amount of intertextuality with Roman power. There's a lot of interaction with Roman power and Roman structures, etc. So maybe in the processes of the formation of the gospel, across some 60 years or so, maybe there were influences from Roman power across that period of time as well, shaping the traditions. And so as an example of that, I look at this incident from around the year 40 involving the Emperor Gaius Caligula, who wanted to set up a statue of himself as Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. He didn't ask the building committee. And Jewish folks were really, really, really passionately opposed to this terrible thing, this terrible sacrilege of the Jerusalem temple. I mean, we actually have a sit-in protest where they lie down on the ground and say to one of the Roman officials, "You can slit our throats before we will let you do this." That's the sort of the degree of passion, of resistance to what Gaius Caligula wanted to do. And what struck me is that we have three accounts of this standoff, three accounts, one in Philo, two in the Jewish historian Josephus. And in those accounts, there are some really interesting emphases that have some resonance with what we find in the gospel. There are emphases on claims of sovereignty. Who has the right to do what they want to in this world? To whom does the world belong? Whose world is it? There are claims and discussions about and presentations around what we would call dualism or binaries, where Gaius Caligula is unrelenting. This is going to happen. It's my way or your death. It's as simple as that. It's going to happen. And that will be the consequence if you don't agree. The governor of Syria, a guy by the name of Petronius, is put in a terribly awkward situation of being commanded to carry out Gaius Caligula's will, but knowing what terrible cost there will be to people's lives if he goes ahead and actually obeys what he's told to do. So this dualism, this either or. Gaius Caligula talks a lot about making himself God or making himself equal to God, which of course is a charge made against Jesus in the gospel as well. Gaius Caligula is trying to bring about this statue by using his agents to carry out his will. This notion of agency, of course, which is so important for the presentation of Jesus. The temple, of course, is so important as the place where all of this is supposed to be carried out. The temple is very important in John's gospel. And of course, all of this is about honor and recognition. And Gaius Caligula is a little pissed that Jewish folks haven't paid him enough honor. And he wants more honor from them. These are big themes in the account of this Gaius Caligula incident, and they're big themes in John's gospel. Now, I don't know for sure that this episode influenced the telling of the story in John's gospel. Nobody knows for sure. Either way, yes or no. But I think it's intriguing that we have these similarities between this episode and what we see in the gospel. And I think it's worth the exercise, which I play out in the book, in the appendix, of spelling this out, because it raises that question that I mentioned. If we want to think about how does John's gospel get to be like this, then why should we look only to religious sources or possible religious influences in a document that emerges in the midst of the Roman Empire? Why would there not be influences from the empire at work in the formation of the traditions about Jesus, who, after all, is crucified on a Roman cross? So it's not a ridiculous exercise to think in those terms. So that's what I think Gaius Caligula might have to do with it, in terms of some of the shapings of the distinctive telling of the Jesus story that we get in John's gospel.
Was the author of 1, 2, and 3 John the same person that wrote the gospel?
Okay, so we're going to move from the gospel to these three writings, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It's kind of intriguing that they're actually called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John when none of the three writings claim anything to do with a person called John. So we might call them the non-Johns because they just don't bear that name. It's a name given to them subsequently in the traditions. I don't think that the person who wrote the gospel, however we think about that, if the gospel went through several stages, what author are we actually talking about? But I don't think whoever is responsible, say, for the final form of the gospel, is the same person who writes these three writings. The Gospel, of course, is anonymous. It's not till late in the 2nd century that the name John ends up on it, sort of 100 years later. 1st John is actually written by a committee. We have a lot of the use of the pronoun we. We have seen such and such. So it seems to be written by a group or representative of a group. So I'm not sure that we can even think of one person author, and it doesn't claim any authorship. It doesn't begin as a letter. It doesn't set itself up as a letter by naming its author or authors. 2nd John, the very short letter, and it is a letter, is written by an elder. That's how the writer identifies himself. And 3rd John is also written by the elder, also identifying themselves with that language. Now, is this the same elder, or are these two different leaders or elders of groups? What makes me think they're probably different is that both 2nd and 3rd John are concerned with one problem, and that is what to do when you're at a little assembly of Jesus folks and somebody turns up, a visiting itinerant preacher turns up and says, I have a word from the Lord for you folks, and I want to deliver it at your gathering. If you're the leader of the group, what do you do? Do you welcome any itinerant, or do you refuse access to an itinerant? In 2nd John, the elder says you should refuse. In 3rd John, the elder says, no, welcome them. That would be the nice thing to do. So if this is the same elder, then he or she has had a remarkable change of mind. Or else we've got two different elders, and these two letters sit side by side in the canon with two different sets of teachings.
And so in that case, one person did not write all the Johannine epistles. In any case, when did those letters date?
Yeah, so I don't think we have one common author for those 3 Johannine writings. The dating is a little difficult. The earliest references that we have to 1st and 2nd John, and by that I mean the earliest references to distinctive content in 1st and 2nd John, comes from the 130s and the 140s. Writers like Polycarp, the Epistle of Barnabas. So if we have writings like that quoting from or clearly referencing 1st and 2nd John, then maybe we can date them to the 110s, the 120s, maybe 130, something like that. 3rd John is much more a mystery. It's not at all clear where 3rd John comes into being. The earliest reference we have to it is attributed to Origen, who dies around 250. So maybe 3rd John comes from the 3rd century, the late 2nd century. We really don't know with any certainty. So that would make them all post-gospel.
Who is the Antichrist in 1st John? Does it perhaps refer to a Roman emperor or someone else?
Oh, I'm sure it's going to be a modern politician. I mean, every politician in the last how long has been identified. The key thing to notice about this Antichrist figure is that it's actually plural. It's not one figure. It's not singular Antichrist. It's Antichrists. So it refers to at least 2 or more people. I don't think it's the Roman emperor. I think the 1st John is much more concerned pastorally with a small group of folks who are Jesus followers, and offers them sort of general exhortation. So I don't think it's the emperor. We also have references there to false prophets and liars. And again, it's very hard to know whether a particular group or particular couple of people are in mind, or whether these are stereotypical references. Every group has its opponents, right? Every group has its enemies. So do we have a stereotypical reference, or do we have specific people? But I think the key thing, though, in recognizing that the language is plural, is that these folks have not come out from the recipients of 1 John, but they're known to the writers of 1 John. So the key passage here is in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, the famous passage that people refer to as a schism. But the writers say that these folks have gone out from us. Not that they've gone out from you, the recipients. They've gone out from us, the writers. So were they part of another group? Were they itinerant teachers? Were they sort of evangelists who were responsible for establishing some of these groups in a particular area? We don't know. And the document is very vague about them. It doesn't tell us what the fight was about, what the conflict was about, what the argument, the separation. It would help if they did tell us, but of course they don't. So a plural, two or more folks who have separated from the writers of 1 John. Is about as much as we know. Now, clearly the name Antichrist suggests some sort of doctrinal issue, or at least some shift of allegiance, no longer of being loyal to Jesus as the Christ. But again, it's very vague, and it's very difficult to have any specificity about it.
Does 1 John attack opponents, and is it a polemical text?
Yeah, I think it's a pastoral text. I don't think it's a polemical text. This has been one of the arguments that have been common in the interpretation of 1 John, the very famous and distinguished work of Raymond Brown, for example, who saw 1 John attacking these opponents and correcting them for their misinterpretations of the gospel in 4 areas. That they got their Christology wrong, they got their eschatology wrong, they got their ethics wrong, and they got their pneumatology, their understanding of the Spirit, wrong. And so in that reading, 1 John is sort of a polemical document, an attack on these folks, exposing their errors. That view has increasingly been questioned in recent times, partially because these opponents have not come out from the recipients. They're known to those who have addressed who are responsible for the letter, but not for the recipients. So I think it's actually a pastoral letter. I think we have references to these folks. It's sort of a general reference, and as sort of a stereotypical, there are opponents, but primarily I think it's an example of what I'd call epidactic rhetoric. That is rhetoric that seeks to strengthen and to affirm the identity and the way of life of the recipients. So it makes it a pastoral letter, reminding them of their origins. You were born of God, you are little children, using that language, reminding them of their key confessions that Jesus is the Christ, Jesus has come in the flesh, Jesus is Son of God, and reminding and exhorting them to appropriate deeds, appropriate actions or virtues. They are to obey the commandments. They are to love one another. They are to take care of one another when someone is in need. These sorts of markers of their identity. So I think it's a pastoral document exhorting and strengthening, encouraging those sorts of understandings and behaviors.
Is First John organized or disorganized?
Yeah, well, it depends who you ask, I think. Some folks have seen it as organized on the basis of the gospel itself. I just don't think that works very well. Some folks have sort of seen an interplay between what they've called Christological tests and ethical tests, and have sort of seen that playing out through the document. But I don't think that is able to cope with everything that we have. I think the approach that I find most encouraging is that we need to focus on the subunits. I think the quest for sort of the big units, the big organization of the writing, has not been very successful. Folks have tried, but I don't think it's been very successful. But I think it hangs together from subunit to subunit. And that's how the thought moves, by key themes, key words, repetition. And it sort of moves along that way from a couple of verses to a couple of verses to a couple of verses to a couple of verses, and makes its argument that way. And so there's quite a bit of repetition. First John is not neatly linear. We start at point A and you get to point D. There's a lot of repetition, but there's a lot of key words that sort of hold the material together. So I think it's organized. It's not organized in the way that I'd like to organize it. It's not organized along linear lines, but the material, I think, is held together by these key words, key themes, and I think you can kind of map it out with lots of pretty different colors, from this word to this word, this theme to this theme, as it unfolds across its 5 chapters.
Who exactly is Corinthus?
Mm.
What is his alleged connection to the Johannine literature, and is the attestation of Corinthus reliable?
Right. Folks have tried to identify these folks who went out, these so-called opponents, which I play down in terms of significance because I think it's more pastoral than polemical. But those who have argued for polemical readings have tried to identify candidates for who these folks might be. Are they Gnostics? Are they Docetists? Or this guy, Corinthus, who, well, what do we know about him? Not very much, and not very much that's reliable. The first reference to him comes around the 140s, which may be a little late if First John is written in the 120s, 130s, but who knows? Commonly, it's said that he separated an understanding of Jesus as a human being from Christ as a divine or spiritual being. They got joined up at Jesus' baptism, but then Christ went back to heaven and Jesus was a human being. Well, that's one of the ways in which his teaching has been summarized, but it's not as clear as that. And there are other accounts of his teaching as well. So I think that makes him a difficult guy to pin down if you're trying to make a polemical argument, and it makes the polemic very muddly. If you wanted to counter this sort of stuff, then there are other ways that you could do it. You could talk about Jesus' birth, you could talk about Jesus' actions, you could talk about Jesus' death, things that just don't happen in First John.
Did some of the opponents no longer regard Jesus as the Messiah?
Yeah, this has been another attempt to identify who these opponents might be. If you understand the letter, if you understand the document to be a polemical attack on these folks who went out. And the theory is that previously they had confessed Jesus as the Messiah, and now had abandoned that confession and had returned to a synagogue. They were Jewish folks. That's how the scenario is usually played out. But there's no reference to a synagogue. There's no reference to a return to a synagogue. And we don't get a huge emphasis in the writing on the confession that Jesus is the Messiah or Jesus is the Christ. There is a reference in chapter 2, verse 22, to the liars who have denied that Jesus is the Christ or Jesus is the Messiah. But it's not a matter that is repeated through the writing. And there's no attempt in the writing to prove in some ways that Jesus was the Messiah, which we would expect if these folks were the target. And again, I make the point that chapter 2, verse 19 says that these opponents, or whoever they were, these secessionists, went out from us, from the writers of the document, not from the recipients of the document. So I think, it's another attempt to take a little bit of 1 John and try to find a scenario for it.
What do you make of the idea that some of the opponents were Docetists and or people that misinterpreted John's gospel?
Yeah, I make the same sort of comments. The Docetist argument has been quite popular and quite common because one of the things that is said about folks is that folks deny that Jesus came in the flesh, which is one of the things that Docetists claimed, that Jesus just seemed, that's where the word Docetist comes from, seemed to be a human being, but wasn't really. And again, I understand what folks are trying to do. If you're trying to read it polemically, you're trying to find who are the targets of the polemic. But when we have that reference to the folks who went out from us, there's no mention of denying Jesus came in the flesh. And again, if this is the big issue, why not narrate stories of Jesus' birth or stories of Jesus' deeds? Why not have Jesus, eating fish everywhere or eating bread everywhere? Constantly snacking at every buffet that he can find, or accounts of Jesus' death. I mean, these would be ways of countering that sort of assertion if it was the target of the writing. So I don't particularly find that helpful. And I've mentioned earlier, I don't think the misinterpretation of the gospel argument is sufficient to account for what we have in 1 John.
And for my final question, in what context are 2 and 3 John written in, and were both of those letters written to address the opponents of the Johannine community?
Yeah, I don't think they're written to opponents, but I think it's, again, I think they're pastoral letters. They are letters, unlike 1 John. We actually have set up as letters from the elder, whoever this elder or elders are. But the issue is very much a local problem, a local issue. And it's not an issue that's reserved only for 2nd and 3rd John. We have it in a number of the New Testament writings. It was a problem across the early Jesus movement, and we have it in writings such as the Didache, that doesn't make it into the canon, but offers instructions for how church life might be organized. Namely, the problem of how do you recognize genuine teachers? How do you recognize a genuine itinerant teacher who turns up and wants to address your assembly? the Goodacre solves the problem by saying, well, they shouldn't stay for longer than 3 days and they don't ask for money. Very pragmatic tests. We don't have those pragmatic tests in 2nd and 3rd John, but that's the issue that both of these writings are trying to address. And you can understand the concern. I mean, these are days where we don't have boards of ordained ministry, as in the contemporary Christian movement. We don't have qualifications like needing a particular degree or something like that. And what we get is 2 different opinions in 2nd and 3rd John. I mean, they sit side by side in the canon and they say 2 different things. In 2nd John, it's 1 chapter, the elder warns the assembly, the elect lady and her children. I take the elect lady as a literal lady, a literal woman who is the leader of this probably house church. Are the children her own literal children, or are they other Jesus believers? I don't know how to call that one. I think it could be a both and. But the elder warns them against welcoming these itinerant teachers, because they're probably going to be deceivers. So a fairly negative view of these itinerants. Don't welcome them. And, you can understand that sort of pastoral protection against false teaching or presence or whatever. But in 3rd John, the elder, is it the same one or is it a different one, writes to a guy called Gaius and encourages the reception of traveling teachers, itinerants. They are to be received. They're to be provided with hospitality. And so 2 different approaches to the same problem. The writings are very generic, and it's hard beyond that general issue to identify any specificity. I mean, are these elders sending their own, in 3rd John, is the elder sending his own agents, his own verified teachers, and saying, yeah, you should welcome them? Or in 2nd John, there are just lots of folks roaming around and it's assumed to be a problem. I mean, we don't get much specificity, but it's a very different issue and very different tone from 1st John in terms of its subject and its orientation, and of course much shorter as well.
So I'd like to remind everybody that the affiliate links to purchase John and Empire and 1, 2, and 3 John, multiple readings deconstructing constructions, will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Warren Carter.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.